Hello there guys. Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about the first dungeon in TERA, the Bastion of Locke. My last video was about some early TERA solo combat impressions, and this was my first experience fighting with a group in TERA. To enter the dungeon, you can either go in with a group of your friends, or if you don't have another 4 people to go in with, you can just click the little dungeon finder button, hit Q, and you'll eventually be teleported to the dungeon with a random group. The dungeon itself is the secret base of an underground cult of Locke, L-O-K, whom you may have been fighting in the overworld for quite a while. The encounter is opened up at level 20, I believe, so I did it a little bit over leveled at level 24, I think. Now, the group that you go in with this thing is pretty standard, with a tank, a healer, and then some DPS. I played the role of a DPS on my warrior. The difficulty of standard mobs isn't really much of anything with this group you have, much easier than soloing, but it can still be somewhat satisfying in terms of combat, just based on that feel that the combat has in this game. And as a melee that isn't a tank, I needed to worry about my positioning still a little bit to not take all that damage. There's 2 boss fights in the dungeon. The first being a 2-part fight with a sort of mini-boss and then this giant rocky fella. And then there's the final boss fight, being another big beastie that needs to be killed. These 2 fights had enough difficulty to them to keep up with my expectations based on the single player experience, and were pretty fun to play with and pretty fun to defeat as a group, and I could see it being a lot more fun if you actually had a group over Skype or something, and you could actually take up more challenging bosses with more teamwork. The looting system in general seems to be an automatic distribution thing, whereas on boss loot you have the option to roll on whatever it drops. You can only roll on things that are applicable to your class, but there's some pretty good items that you can find off those bosses. Whereas on the general populace, the general mobs in the game, in the dungeon, they tend to drop a lot of things, and you'll get about 1/5 of that loot. And even with that 1/5, I found my inventory filling up pretty damn fast. Overall, it's a good look at future content and PvE content, although I can only hope it gets better and more difficult from here, and makes more and more use of that action-style combat. It's still pretty traditional though, nothing revolutionary in terms of dungeon level design, although that could easily change in future dungeons. The Bastion of Locke is a pretty good dungeon, and definitely a good place to go for some extra experience and some good equipment for the level. Probably the same thing applies to most dungeons throughout the game, so go check them out. If you haven't picked up TERA yet, it is a completely free game, so give it a try. Otherwise, I've been Maple Dungeons, and I will see you next time.